Well, greetings again, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on the perils of radical individualism, the myth and the quest for an alternative. I'm Dr. Gordon E. Carkner, a meta-educator with UBC graduate students, author, blogger, and a webinar producer. Very happy you were able to join me to think through some of the important issues of how the individual sees themselves in society today. So here's the big picture of what we want to cover. First of all, the allure of individualism. Secondly, a little bit of a historical and philosophical roots. Questions raised about RI, some of the deceptions and seductions. And then looking at possibly a paradigm shift of the individual within community. And finally, redeemed freedom and individuality. I have a couple of conclusions after that, and some bibliography. So what is the allure of radical individualism today? Here's the mantra: I am who I am. I will become who I choose to become. No one else will choose for me. I interpret myself, speak for myself, and justify my behavior. Freedom as self-determination entails a process of self-legislation, self-control, and self-justification. I know what's best or good for me. Here's a key point. My very identity is shaped by rebellion or agonism against other views of my destiny, against authority or social stereotypes. RI often offers a strong attraction at first glance, especially for the young, strong, and bright, or the people who want to make a name for themselves in a new business, technology, or perhaps Hollywood. We need these imaginative, ambitious, entrepreneurial people among us to innovate, create jobs and wealth. They often pave the way forward and pioneer the technological, social, and economic landscape. So there's a lot to be said for the strengths in individualism. Consistent with RI, it is often assumed that if we only had more freedom to self-determine, we would discover our fullest selves to be fulfilled, happy, and good. So the key words here are actually adventure and conquest, command and control. You'll see that as we go through the talk. So secondly, we want to talk about a bit of history of RI, where it comes from. This is very brief, of course. Historically and intellectually, radical individualism and self-determining freedom, they go together, are a product of modernity that has come to dominate Western thought since the 18th century. It is known as the Enlightenment. It includes both early modernity and late modernity. In terms of early modernity, one thinks of René Descartes, his cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, as a kind of summons to individual will to power and rationalism. And science is at the heart of this. The autonomous individual is released from moral strictures of religion, past history, and tradition. And the values of radical individualism in early modernity is lots of choice, self-reliance, and domination. It also entails a weakened sense of obligation to others, except for mutually agreed self-interest. Now, in late modernity, RI is intensified even further, represented by Michel Foucault. Aesthetics come into play, personal feelings, and individual choice are a top priority as one stylizes one's life. One could say reinvents oneself as a work of art, as Foucault said. This is the romantic, expressive dimension of radical individualism, with roots going back to Nietzsche and Heidegger. The prime obligation is to make myself according to my own design and ambition. Self-construction means my moral character has become a subject of creative self-interpretation. So in a sense, the key word here is self-expression or expressivism. Further on a brief history, this is Christoph Schwäbel sort of trying to sum up the transitions in radical individualism, or individualism as such. St. Andrews University scholar Christoph Schwäbel traces the three conceptual stages of freedom that Western culture has transitioned through. A, the quest for release from coercion, often referred to as liberation from oppression or slavery. We hear things like, give me my voice, my opportunity to succeed, my rights and freedoms. B, the quest for release from internal or cultural blockages to free expression. That is, breaking out of stereotypes or identities that bind or trap me. One thinks of race and gender in this category, or minority group. And finally, self-constitutive freedom as an ideal of self-definition and self-interpretation. The radical or revolutionary definition of freedom. And here we look to Michel Foucault. So freedom or autonomy in this extreme sense takes up the central controlling position in self-understanding and ethical posture. Self-mastery and self-love, also called self-care, are critical to this third move. Foucault is a prime example of promoting this thin self. Freedom for him is ontological. It shapes the fundamental principle of understanding what it means to be human. It involves a re-enchantment with myself, composing an identity that pulls back inside my bunker of self-protection and self-creation. That's a bit of an overview on the history of radical individualism. Now we begin to talk about some of the people that are raising some questions today about this posture in life, this self-concept. Many bright sociological and philosophical thinkers and public intellectuals question this third perspective in particular. They want to argue that we, in fact, need liberation from this myth of radical individualism and self-determined freedom. We need to be saved from freedom as an end in itself, i.e., a release from all moral obligations. Freedom needs to be seen in proper context, to be examined for its content, lest it become a destructive mythos, a socio-relational weapon of mass destruction, some might say. Some of the people that are raising these questions are Christopher Lasch, Robert Bellah, Scott Peck, Matthew Crawford, Charles Taylor, Christoph Schwäbel, and Alistair McFadyen. These are some of the sources we've looked to for this discussion. So when we reflect on it, we have to agree that our public language of freedom today does have a kind of mythological flavor that creates a mask for a disguised self-interest. Freedom to be, attain, and do whatever I want, whenever I want. This can lead to a grandiose sense of one's own identity and worth. Theomania, the desire to be like a god, has worked its ruin in society again and again. In fact, there is a historical cultural coincidence between the birth of our radical concept of freedom and the denial of God in Western philosophy. We suggest that it results from human attempts to acquire the kind of freedom one normally attributes only to God, omniscient, omnipotent, infinite. Indeed, it's a kind of heady affair, this. This perspective on freedom tends to imply that the self must usurp the space once given to God. Human and divine freedom are set in direct competition, and we will see that this has serious consequences. So what are some of the social consequences of radical individualism? What emerges here, says Christoph Schwäbel, is a dislocation in the relational order. When persons aspire to be more than human, they actually become less than human. We often find the radical conception of freedom as absolute and unlimited lies at the heart of many of the most dehumanizing tendencies in modern history. where ideologies like communism and fascism replace religion as the corporate social imaginary. When freedom is seen as radically self-constituted, responsibility is restricted to the responsibility of agents to themselves primarily. It is at this point that the claim of radical autonomy cannot be distinguished from an escape into unaccountability. It's a serious claim. We know it's a fact that as many radical individualists gain power and influence, they tend to intensify in their narcissism, to become a law to themselves, auto nomos. The scope of perceived moral responsibility ends with one's perceived needs, desires, creativity, and power. Everything else must be eliminated. The reigning ethos claims that I alone must reach my full potential. And we know many hardcore individualists are predictably kind of selfish and egotistical and sometimes boring because they're so predictable, like the Hollow Men of T.S. Eliot. So this leads us to begin a discussion of the deceptions and seductions of radical individualism. And here we draw on a British scholar, Alistair McFadyen. He reflects on the deep deceptions of radical freedom. The free pursuit of private self-interest has a naturally conflicting form, since the otherness of the individual means that their interests must be opposed. One needs freedom from what is other in order to be oneself. Important point to underline. Personal self-centeredness is essential, for autonomy is a private place that has to be protected by fencing it off from the sphere of relation, and therefore from the otherness of God and one's neighbors. Autonomy is something one has in self-possession, apart from relation to God and others, in an exclusive and private orientation on an asocial personal center. So the key words here I've said are isolation and, in a sense, a refusal of responsibility for the other. It invokes the concerns of Emmanuel Levinas. Here is a further implication of the deceptions, further deception, I guess you could say. It's the language of moral autism. If it is the fact that humans are moral all the way down, we have some really important insights here from Matthew Crawford. Matthew is a senior fellow at the University of Virginia's Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture. He detects a serious flaw in the current quest for excellence. This is from his book, The World Outside Your Head. He claims that our emphasis on radical individualism and autonomy is leading us into an unhealthy moral autism. We are actually losing our agency and our moral skill to discern and choose wisely. He questions whether we can be the source of the norms by which we justify ourselves, a radical responsibility for which we may not really be prepared and often are not. He notes that we actually need others like friends, family, colleagues, social group to check our own self-understanding. This is called social triangulation. They tell us when we're doing okay, that we are good or appropriate, or sometimes not up to our best effort or downright irresponsible. Such accountability is essential to self as chooser. So that's the point of the deception of moral autism. And then there's hardcore narcissism. We know that there are expensive cultural and personal costs of narcissism, which result from radical individualism. Here we look to Scott Peck, a psychiatrist, who defines the character of the narcissistic personality in People of the Lie. A, consistent destructive scapegoating behavior, which may often be quite subtle, projecting one's problems on others. B, excessive, albeit usually covert, intolerance to criticism and other forms of narcissistic injury. C, pronounced concern with public image and self-image of respectability, contributing to a stability of lifestyle, but also to pretentiousness and denial of hateful feelings or vengeful motives. And finally, intellectual deviousness with an increased likelihood of mild schizophrenic disturbance. Just draw on an example of this, when I look back at 2008 and the great global financial crisis, I see that the unhealthy, irresponsible behaviors of financial executives and regulators, and actually government officials as well, at various levels around the world, causing this crisis. John R. Talbot has logged this history in his book, Contagion, quite insightful book. And we know today that we can easily find a YouTuber who's featuring insights on how to handle a narcissist in your life. So there are obviously a lot of people dealing with a narcissist in their family or in their work life. And this can be a very painful experience, a very painful relationship. Back to Matthew Crawford and the dark side of excellence on the same trajectory. In a time of civil or cultural flux where it's unclear what the rules or norms are in the greater society, it's quite difficult for us to understand ourselves socially. It leaves us with a moral, spiritual deficit, I guess you could say. We feel isolated, disempowered, uncertain, afraid to make moral judgments and decisions. This traps us in an existential angst. And many people today many psychologists talk about an existential identity crisis for many people in our culture, many young people. As a result, we become victims of the values of the marketplace: productivity, performance, usefulness, cash out value. But we know that the marketplace was never meant to set standards of human relations, moral identity, or personal worth. Our capitalist consumer culture and ideology is very strong. Performance goes all the way down. And psychologist, who's a friend of Matthew, psychologist Alan Ehrenberg, in his book, Weariness of the Self, notes that this is leading to an epidemic level of depression and abuse of performance-enhancing drugs among high achievers. It's because enough is never enough. There's always more we could do to pursue excellence and impress our overseers. So the bottom line here is what starts as an inspiring motivator, high quality work, high achievement, being proud of my work, morphs into a kind of personal slavery if you have no other values to guide and set boundaries for you. So it seems from our discussion so far that we kind of need a paradigm shift in our thinking about individualism or the individual and society, and that's what we turn to now. We want to talk about individuals in community, and we want to say that the common good can act as a counterculture to radical individualism. Community offers a context for long-term mutual relational commitments. We call it a win-win scenario. On the other hand, utilitarian individualism encourages us to use other people for our own prestige, wealth, or progress. But the Christian faith, by contrast, challenges us to make other people an end in themselves, to nurture and care for them. Such commitments have an enriching effect. Bonds develop and affirm the worth, identity, and potential of each individual within these communities. Genuine community is a space to contribute, to invest spiritually and emotionally, and to discover the value of mutual accountability. It can be a wonderful experience to pour yourself into a community and commit to it long term. On the other hand, operating as a lone wolf, a person cannot find full emotional and psychological health. Within community, however, they can live out their truest selves, not apart from other people, but among them, at work, in love, while learning. That's at university, for instance. Psychologists confirm that there's a tremendous personal health to be discovered by those who value long-term commitment to other people. That's how we really grow. Genuine community is a space to find one's home, one's sense of home, security, significance, and meaning. So we're talking about a counterculture or a paradigm shift here. When we think about the individual flourishing within community rather than apart from it. In a sense, Michel Foucault and Charles Taylor are good scholars who represent the two sides of this coin. One, Charles Taylor believes on one's identity flourishing within community. Michel Foucault really strongly believes that the individual must break free, wedge themselves free from the community in order to flourish as an individual. And that leads to that radical individualism. What are the community benefits? Clearly, we need an alternative paradigm to RI. Community can be a tremendous place of healing for empty, wounded, selfish individuals, including the disenchanted workaholic or high achiever who's on the edge of burnout. People can find a place of dignity, worth, and celebration. And Christoph Schwäbel is very good at capturing the gravitas of community. Here's a quote from him. The true measure of freedom is love as the relationship which makes the flourishing of the other the condition of self-fulfillment. Human freedom becomes the icon of divine freedom, where the freedom of divine grace constitutes the grace of human freedom. That most poignant image of hope, the kingdom of God, expresses the relationship of free divine love and loving human freedom. They go together in depicting the ultimate purpose of God's action as the perfected community of love with his creation. The fulfillment of God's reign and the salvation of creation are actualized together in the community of the love of God. This is a quote worth reflecting on. Something you could put on your wall, I guess, in terms of arguing for the big picture on community and its benefits, its integrity. And our final point is really on the question of redeemed freedom, since individuality and freedom are closely connected, and radical individualism talks about this autonomous idea of freedom where you're not accountable to a community. So we need to talk about how to redeem freedom and individuality. And this was a major emphasis in my PhD thesis as I examined Michel Foucault's understanding of the constitution of the moral self in dialogue with Charles Taylor. So redeemed freedom takes on a distinctively communal character, I concluded. It is contextualized within a conversation, within relationships between fellow interlocutors, against the backdrop of larger narrative that makes sense of self and the meaning of life. This is a deep structure of the thick self, as Taylor might say it. Individual freedom releases some sovereignty to community and makes space for the other. And this avoids some of the pitfalls and deficits of radical autonomy. As one gains a social identity, one reaps amazing benefits, both tangible and intangible. Now, Foucault, on the other hand, articulates freedom as a flight from one's neighbor. The aesthetic self is part fugitive, part manipulator. Its context is reduced to a life of contest with the other. And we've talked about this, the agonism, manipulating power relations and truth gains to one's advantage. There is a certain validity to concerns about enslavement, as we've said, but the lack of vision for relationships that are other than a contest of wills is a problem. Human relations can also be informed by love, compassion, and cooperation, as many of us know. So the bottom line here is that this type of freedom and accountable individuality is destined to find its fulfillment, not in a self-justifying control, but in seeking out a communion of love and mutual respect. Charles Taylor argues this strongly in his books, Sources of the Self, A Secular Age, and the language animal. These are his three of his great tomes. And if you really want to get into Charles Taylor, it's a good place to start. And finally, we want to look at this not just from a theological perspective or Christian perspective, but also from a sociological outlook. So we call on Robert Bellah and the idea of the social self. Noted American sociologist Robert Bellah offers a brilliant analysis of American individualism. He talks about the difference between individuals in community and radical individualism, which is separating itself from community, has very skeptical views of other persons or other social groups. He says this: a community is a group of people who are socially interdependent, who participate together in discussion and decision-making, and who share certain practices that define the community and are nurtured by it. It's a powerful cultural fiction, he says, that we not only can, but must make our deepest beliefs in the isolation of our private selves. There are truths we do not see when we adopt the language of radical individualism. According to German sociologist Emil Durkheim, the group or the social solidarity is a prerequisite for the identity of the individual. And George Herbert Mead, another turn of the century sociologist, notes that meaning is a relational or interpersonal matter, not a mere individual phenomenon. So they are saying basically that you don't have to make up the whole moral and intellectual universe on your own. You don't have to create your own reality. So the good news in all of this is that we can move past the painful void of alienation into self-discovery regarding beliefs, values, and personal convictions. Within a community of caring interlocutors, we can test our thoughts and convictions while we grow in character. Otherwise, we are fragmented, lonely, virtually incomprehensible to ourselves. And that's a good point, that we really need other people to know who we are as a self. Somebody who's brilliantly articulated this case is New York Times columnist David Brooks, in his two books, The Road to Character, in which he analyzes several top intellectuals and social activists, one US president, and he's got a beautiful statement in the back of the book on the 15 of the virtues. And then his book, The Second Mountain, which talks about how many of us are trained in the first mountain of our vocation and our skill set, but we miss out on the development of our moral character. And he agrees that the goal of the individual should be to grow as a moral person through your life. So I recommend those two books to build out from this theme. Okay, some conclusions in all of this. I think we've seen, however briefly, that radical individualism is attractive to many, but rife with pitfalls and perils. It should cause us to pause and reflect on what is driving us after all. And is that good? And are we going in a good direction with our lives? Our eye is riddled with games, deceptions, and misrepresentations of reality that are harmful to ourselves and others. Community, we say, is the key environment to discover, nurture, and shape the individual towards mature, responsible adulthood. That is the case we're arguing. That is our stance. And finally, redeemed freedom, which is connected to the moral good. This is all part of my thesis and part of the discourse of Charles Taylor in Sources of the Self, creates a space for healing, maturity, and the thick self. So I also recommend the YouTube video that I've done on Charles Taylor and the Modern Quest for Identity. And I quote from that presentation. That's on YouTube. The thick self means words and actions cohere. We pursue what is really important without deviation or distraction by contrary desires. We pursue wholeness and unity of motives, not brokenness and fragmentation. We overcome dispersal and contradiction or self-stultification. So I think that's the aspiration at the end of this talk, is that we will all move towards the thick self, the integrated self, the whole person. Now here's the bibliography, and I won't go through all of this, but these are the references, the sources that I've drawn on for this analysis. And at the bottom, you see my PhD thesis, which you can find on my blog site. You can download it from my blog site, A Critical Examination of Michel Foucault's Concept of Moral Self-Constitution in Dialogue with Charles Taylor. I want to thank you so much for joining me in this discussion on radical individualism, its perils, and the promise of individuals finding their home in community. Thank you so much. All the best, and may you all flourish going forward.